pleasure to introduce Professor Michele Di Francesco, Professor of Logic and Philosophy of Science. He has been our Dean until 2013 and now is Rector of the University Institute of Advanced Studies in Pavia. Michele has been the President of the Italian Society of Analytic Philosophy and also of the European Society of Analytic Philosophy, and he has done a lot of works on many topics such as consciousness, philosophy of mind, extended mind, and so it is really a big pleasure to have here Michele as our invited speaker of this afternoon session. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. After his presentation, it's late, so goodbye. It was a pleasure. So, I would like to thank everybody here and the people who organized this workshop, Roberta De Monticelli, Elisabetta Sacchi, Francesca De Vecchi, and all the staff, Emanuele Bottazzi, Francesca Forlé and Sara Songoria, and especially Francesca and Sara who locked the door so nobody can go out now and skip the conference. Thank you very much. The workshop, you know, was devoted to Lynne's Baker Challenge. So I think that today we already heard a lot of interesting comments of Lynne Baker philosophy, and I'm going to present a contribution who stems from the philosophical reflection of cognitive neuroscience and in fact also cognitive psychology. And I'm more interested in epistemological issues than in metaphysical ones. And I'm not so good in metaphysical to discuss the wonderful argument that Lynne presented. I'm sorry about that, but I hope to say something which is consonant with her perspective. And in particular, I organized my talk in the following way. First of all, I claim that contemporary science of the mind privileges a bottom-up approach to self-consciousness. And in this context, self-conscious rational agents are presented as an illusion. Michael Powell this morning has already said something about Dennett's position. I'm going to go back to Dennett for a while. And the idea is the characterization of the self, of the virtual space of presence, a center of narrative gravity, something which is reconstructed as the owner of the stream of consciousness, but in fact, who is causally inert. And a third point is that we need a robust self to explain the kind of intentional action and self-understanding presupposed by common sense psychology and social science. I insist on the fact that social sciences very often are based on the notion of the self, of the subject of action, which is more, which is closer to the personal level than to the neurocognitive reconstruction of our agency. And so we face a dilemma: either we give up the classical notion of rational self-conscious agent, or you should reject the relativistic doubts about the self and find a way to restore a robust theory of the subject. And in this context, I present some reason to believe that a robust theory of the self is perfectly compatible with the kind of argument which are we were presented by neurocognitive science. And doing that, I'm presenting certain idea that I'm developing with my colleague Massimo Varraffa and Alfredo Paternoster. So I would like to mention them at the beginning of the talk. Lynne Baker's defense of the necessity of a robust self is based on an analysis of the robust filters of perspective. Mine would be based on a pluralistic reading of the nature of contemporary science of the mental. And this is in green, and the part in green are part that I'm not sure to be able to present for time problems. In the final part of my talk, perhaps I confront my strategy with Lynne Baker's approach, showing the many points of agreement, the few points of disagreement, or at least of perhaps a sort of partial condivision. So, terminology, everybody uses self in a loose way. I'm going to do the same, so we skip. And so the point now is I would like to give to explain why robust self is challenged by contemporary cognitive science. The very point of the part shows the consideration that at least in the last 50 years, the sciences of the mind have been mostly concerned with unconscious function. This was true both from the classical cognitive science and from contemporary neurocognitive science. Cognitive processes studied by cognitive science, such as perception, reasoning, language, understanding, are not accessible to consciousness. The process, not the outcome of the process, of course. We are conscious of the outcome of our cognitive process, but the mechanism, of course, cannot be studied or discovered by introspection. Only their inputs or outputs can be assessed. We are aware of the final result of the processes, not of their internal dynamics. In this perspective, the unconscious is in a way much more important than the conscious, insofar as it is the unconscious that explains the abilities manifested in our behavior. Just one example, the case of language, very shortly. In order to understand the sentence, we have to understand the grammatical structure of the sentence. We have also, before that, to start from a nearly continuous sequence of sound and segment it into words. Then we have to face the presence of many ambiguous words and the relation with the context. All this machinery is working in our mind, but we have no idea how we can do that. We have no awareness at all of these complicated processes, and we are not conscious of having a grammar rule inside our heads, apart from Noam Chomsky probably, but it's an exception. And this is something quite familiar, but the example shows that the unconscious level of explanation is the fundamental level according with the methodology of cognitive science. According to the bottom-up approach, self-consciousness is not a simple psychological state, but rather a process which is a psychobiological system self-representing. This self-representation is the outcome of a repertoire of psychological maneuver generated by unconscious, subpersonal, mechanical, and automatical processes. I stress this expression, unconscious, subpersonal, mechanical, automatic. Something very, very far away from the kind of explanation of the working of the subject at the personal level. So there is a big gap now here. Against the Cartesian, I use Cartesian as a very loose level. The Cartesian approach, the self is not taken as a primitive, a mental entity describable as the owner of its own mental states. Rather, it is taken as the result of a process of construction. We start with subpersonal, unconscious processes. Now, we have to present in a few words why certain important and really influent philosophical views transformed this methodological approach to the study of the mind in a sort of ontological deconstruction of the self. And many philosophers start from the non-primary derivative nature of the self, of self-consciousness, to infer its status as an illusory byproduct of the real neurobiological events, as devoid of any explanatory role. Probably the best known example is Daniel Dennett. In light of a large amount of data from the neurocognitive science, Dennett rejected the hypothesis that there is in some area of the brain a place where it all comes together. Some sort of a central executive system that coordinates all the cognitive operation. and he criticized it as the might of the Cartesian theater. So there is no Cartesian theater. To this, Dennett opposes his theory, and well, it's not the case. Almost everybody knows that the central element of Dennett's theory. The idea is that we don't need a theory of the self, but we need a theory of the illusion of the self. So the science of consciousness should explain how we have the feeling of the existence of a subject experience with the kind of characteristics which are described by folk psychology, personal psychology, and the like. So from the very beginning, then I think that the target, the aim, the goal of a scientific explanation of self-consciousness is to explain how we are victim of an illusion. And how we posit a center of narrative gravity, as Michele said this morning. And the narrative is the result of the working of what Dennett called the Joycean machine. And this is a metaphor, a useful metaphor. Even if it is in green, I can just remember that Dennett say that in our brain there is a covered together collection of specialist brain circuits. Then, thanks to family of habits inculcated partly by culture and partly by individual self-exploration, conspire together to produce a more or less orderly, more or less effective, more or less well-designed virtual machine. And this is the machine who produces the virtual captain, that is the self, the illusory self. Now, then the book is an old book now. It was published at the beginning of the 1990, and not so good. And but there is something in contemporary research we can find which is consonant with certain aspects of Dennett theory. In particular, there is a sort of there was at the end of the 90s the global workspace theory of consciousness proposed by Bernard Bass that was implemented at the neural level by Lynne and collaborators. According to these researchers, there are two computational spaces within the brain, each characterized by a distinct pattern of connectivity. The first space is a set of parallel distributed and functional specialized processor or modular subsystems. This is the kind of the society of mind described by Martin Minsky quoted today. And of course, this part of the working of the brain is modular, local, distributed. There is no integration, and so in a certain sense, there cannot be self-consciousness, but only automatic agents. A sort, an assembly of zombies. But there is a second space, a neural global workspace, consisting of a distributed set of cortical neurons with long-distance connection, particularly dense in prefrontal, cingulate, and parietal regions, which are capable of interconnecting the multiple specialized processor and can broadcast signals at the brain scale in a spontaneous and sudden manner. This global neuronal workspace breaks the modularity of the nervous system and produces this kind of the amount of integration and the unity of the mind that can explain the stream of consciousness and, if we are the Nettians, the illusion of the self of an hour of the processes. Just a couple of factors of the theory interesting from the relativistic point of view. It assumed that the neurocognitive architecture underlined the unity of consciousness as a distributed computational system with no central controller, no homunculus in the brain. And the second, it makes massive use of recursive functional decomposition, an indispensable requirement to get rid of any homunculus who, nested in a sort of incarnation of the pineal gland, scans the stream of consciousness. Another aspect of this. So, just a few comments of this very quick presentation of a way to start from cognitive neuroscience and ending with a sort of a philosophical eliminativistic interpretation of the data. Or there is not of the data, of the theory. But here we are speaking of theory, even if there are some evidence about the cortical regions which are connected in the way they are described in the theory, of course. So the eliminativist conclusion about the self is not necessitated by contemporary cognitive science, but we may say that it's fully consonant with the cognitive and neurocognitive science, start from the idea of the fruitfulness of the bottom-up approach, and this approach does not appeal to our introspective self-knowledge, but to the result of investigation into the gradual construction of human self-awareness. From the automatic and reflexive construction or representation of the external world, through the bodily self-motoring, to self-consciousness as introspective recognition of the presence of an inner experiential space. Here again, I'm going very fast, but the point is that this kind of analysis is based on the idea that we have to explain consciousness in a sort of evolutionary way, both at the starting from more basic functions and going on to recognize the emergence of more complex functions, but all new stuff is explained with reference to something which are at a lower level in the explanation order. The outcome is a criticism of the primacy of self-conscious subjectivity, where the latter, starting from the primary datum, become an articulated construction out of several neurocognitive and psychosocial components. Another important, I think, aspect of this kind of approach, quite an interesting one, is the acknowledgement of the mixed and the multifaceted nature of the self. Minimal, autobiographical, narrative, and social selves appear to reflect different aspects and different stages of the interaction between the neurocognitive and psychosocial components. Even if this is quite evident, for example, in Antonio Damasio's theory of the self, in which we start from a core self and then we go on until the autobiographical self, with a small problem, like in the your story. I mean, in the Damasio theory, we have a lot of precise neurobiological hypotheses about location of the nuclear self, but when we come to narrative self, there is something, well, here a miracle happens. There is no exactly, we stop to refer to neurobiological location of the processes, and we say, but somewhere in the brain, the activity produces the narrative, the autobiographical self. We start finding any reference to anatomy or to functional anatomy. And this is interesting, and say that perhaps the rhetoric is very compelling, but in fact we don't have some empirical data about how this is possible. And the fact that we put in a linear narrative the emergence of the self this way, give the impression we have a sort of neurobiological foundations. But there is no theory of how the autobiographical self is produced at the neurobiological level, apart from interesting reflection, of course, of memory and also pathologies of memory and so on. So this was the first part, the presentation of a sort of interpretation of the data of the cognitive and neurocognitive science in an eliminativistic vision of the self. And I remember the dilemma I presented at the beginning of the talk. Either we give up the classical notion of rational self-conscious agent, or should we reject the eliminativistic doubts about the self and find a way to restore a robust theory of the self? I quite sure that Lynne's position should be the offer a solution of the dilemma with many aspects, but the most relevant, of course, is a defense of the reducibility or robust first-person perspective, of course. And she discussed it in a chapter, Dennis theory, Metzinger theory, and there was something interesting. We may speak about that later on. But the point that I share the same strategies, that is the rejection of eliminativism, but I prefer to follow a different route. I argue that there are many reasons to believe that first, a robust theory of the self is not ruled out by the eliminativist reading of contemporary science of the mental. On the contrary, is fully consonant with contemporary neurocognitive science. So what I would like to say that there are reasons to believe, even at the scientific level, that we need a robust theory of the self to explain human behavior. We cannot content with a theory of the illusory nature of the self. And this I try to say, of course, in a very sketchy way. So let's try to offer a realistic reading of then empirical data. The first question is how virtual is then itself? Here there are some difficulties. I'm going from the intuitive point of view, then I suggest something more theoretical. From the intuitive point of view, we may say that on the one hand it is said that the itself it is an abstraction devoid of real causal powers, but on the other hand it is illusory character, the self, the virtual captain, is indeed a useful and even essential device. The complex social organisms that we are need a virtual self for their various survival, their social interactions, their decision making, and so on. So something is need to explain this apparent contradiction. Of course, Dennett has some answers to this. Well, okay, we see. On the one hand, we have then a deflationist conception of the self, according to which the self is a mere abstraction, analogous to the non-existent but useful center of gravity of a physical body. But on the other hand, there is an open alternative, a realist or inflationist position, compatible with everything Dennett says about the architecture of human cognitive system. Or at least I try to show that. According to the inflationist option, the Georgian machine is not a Dacefoot device, but a cognitive bottom-up mechanism that produces a reasonable, stable, and integrated autobiographical self, something which is best understood as the ongoing result of the narrative process. This ego process, saying this way, this need not to be fully accessible to the cognitive system to which it belongs. There is no need to postulate a perfect, transparent self. This is not a Cartesian self, of course. The object of infallible knowledge, introspective representations of the narrative self could be inaccurate and unreliable. Epistemic inaccuracy of this kind, of course, does not threaten the reality of what it is misrepresented. And moreover, even this misrepresentation of the self affect the way a person leads his life. This is a very important point. People go to the psychoanalyst and spend years and years and years to change their failing, their own misrepresentation. If they are such an ephemeral aspect of our life as in the Joycean machine model, how it is possible? I agree with Lynne Baker's criticism of critical analysis of characters, utilization of all the scientific report of the failure of introspections, because the fact that our self-knowledge is highly fallible doesn't mean that we have not a knowledge of something. we have a wrong knowledge of something, but there is not a something who disappear for the only fact that we have a mistaken knowledge of it. Why up to now I presented a kind of intuitive answer to Dennis' doubts. Now I would like to say something more, and I mentioned just one aspect. This one, the self-narration produced by the Joycean machine is not at all contingent and evanescent, since it is firmly anchored on personality structures. In fact, if we look at the most recent development in personality psychology, we find that the ability to perceive our own identity in terms of narrative identity stems at least from two cognitive layers. The first are traits of personality, largely determined by genetic factors and substantially stable through the life cycle. And the second are goals, plans, project values, and other constructs, that is motivational and strategic roles and contexts that define the life of an individual. Here I'm referring to the wide amount of psychological research and typical experimental psychological research on personality. And if we take the Joycean machine as the constructor of the narrative cells, well, the Joycean machine works with the construction of personality traits. We can be tested, empirically investigated, and we have different theories of the system. So we are not studying the birth of an illusion. We are studying the construction of something which is causally effective and very important for our nature of people with a personal identity through time. In this sense, the experimental investigation of the mechanism underlying the construction of identity can be seen as a psychological hypothesis about the functioning of the extended or robust Joycean machine. I use the term robust Joycean machine to compare with your robust third-person perspective. Even if with Alfredo Tomasetta we used the same expression in Granada last year, so when I found your choice of robust expression, I was happy to find in your book the robust third-person perspective. And the idea that we may have a scientific theory of the robust Joycean machine could be developed. And here, the reference to the necessity of the multi-level explanation of the robust Joycean machine comes in. These explanations, in fact, are located at the intersection of several psychological disciplines: personality psychology, social psychology, developmental psychology, dynamical psychology, all potentially interacting with neurocognitive research. And so, these are all, apart perhaps with dynamical psychology, I can imagine certain neuroscientists which are not at ease with that because it's something too close to psychoanalysis, you know. But we are speaking about scientific researches with a good pedigree, with experimental methodology. So, this kind of researches are exactly what we need in order to explain how does the robust Joycean machine works. And I give just a couple of examples about two notions developing in the dynamical psychology domain, the notion of motivation and attachment. The concept of motivation and attachment are at the core of psychodynamical theories that are fluidly interactive in cognitive science. Now the concept of motivation and attachment can be definitely considered as an advance over the concepts that were formerly used to account for the same phenomena. But these concepts are very near to the personal level. In other terms, they did not undergo yet maybe yet, they didn't undergo the processes of fragmentation and refiguration that were predicted by Patricia Churchland in her neurophilosophical idea of the necessary development of psychology. They still are useful concepts very close to the personal level of analysis, and they confront each other. They confront with the more brain-oriented research on the basis of motivation and action and choice, and also I'll show later. And therefore, when the term motivation is defined as the whole spectrum of those factors that trigger, maintain, intensify, modulate, or terminate physical activities or psychological events of any kind, we easily realize that it is a term that groups totally a heterogeneous bunch of factors which are very difficult to classify at the basic neuronal level. The problem is that we need higher level classification to put together things which are that we cannot find at the neural level. But at times such factors are to be examined individually. Of course it is obvious, but often it is useful to consider them all together under the label motivations. The main point here is that in any case the use of such term was a conceptual progress. And the same we can say with the term attachment. Attachment was introduced to explain the relation with the newborn and the caregivers in the few days and months of life. Attachment is very important to define the kind of social relationship that the human being develop in the last part of their life. And it is a theory which is now confronted with cognitive neuroscience. And so there are attachment, and here again the term attachment does not refer to homogeneous and well identifiable phenomenon if you look of course at the brain level. We speak of attachment behaviors, we speak of subject experience of attachment. We also can barely be grouped together and classified. But attachment itself is an idea between the imaginative and the abstract, which originates from the extension of expressions such as to keep attached or other. However, reference to this idea do increase our understanding of the ontogenetic roots of the subject personality and narrative identity. This is a quote from a book on attachment, and in red you find reference to different kind of concept. You know, attachment.
Is it Susanna Siegel or another Siegel?
No, is
a man.
Yeah, it's a man.
It's not.
We speak in the quote. We find an interpersonal relationship that helps the immature brain to use better function of the parent's brain to organize his own processes. It speaks about emotional translation, sensitive responses, positive emotional states. But then we speak about reducing uncomfortable emotion, fear, anxiety, sadness, enable the children to be soothed, and give them a haven of safety when they are upset. The patterning or organization of attachment relationship during infancy is associated with characteristic processes of emotional regulation, social access to autobiographical memory, and the development of self-reflection and narrative. When I read this passage for the first time, I was really impressed by the multiplicity of level of analysis we find in this very short passage. So we may say, okay, but this is the eliminativist reaction. Maybe okay, this shows that the passage is is not an example of good science because it's obscure, confused, and so on. But in fact, this is exactly the kind of instrument of analysis psychiatry, psychology use to explain human behavior. And for example, in Italy, Giovanni Liotti is doing very interesting research connecting neurocognitive science to the attachment researches. He published a book, I think in Italian, it's called The Interpersonal Dimension of Consciousness, in which he used the attachment theory to develop the theory of the we intentionality and the public construction of the self, and which is of the greatest interest according to me. So if this notion is useful to understand, and this notion has this kind of a characteristic, we shouldn't exclude it from our oops. So Sarah introduced the epistemological model. That's great.
She's very moral.
Yes, of course, she's very moral. The epistemological moral that can be drawn from this case of dialectic interaction between personal and subpersonal level of investigation can be expressed in the following way. According to the eliminativist history of psychology, according to the eliminativist history of psychology consists in a linear process through which the systematic research supersedes and goes beyond common sense psychology, and together with it psychophysical psychology. So the idea is we have a sort of linear progress. We start with common sense, personal, psychological notion, and ends with neurobiological notion. And the achievement of a better understanding is reached by the elimination of the personal psychology. Of course, this is a caricatural, forced reading, but not so forced if we take for granted the rhetoric, at least, of many of the eliminativistic positions. And as a matter of fact, contemporary science of the mind allows and requires the presence of a multiplicity of levels of explanation. Okay, thank you.
No, era
finito?
No,
Non è stato chiaro, è stato...
no, thank you, Elisabeth. What I did up to now was to present a reading of certain results of neurocognitive science, and then to argue for the present in legitimate scientific enterprise of the possibility of different reading. This is not at all something new in the reflection of the philosophy of science, the philosophy of cognitive sciences. Just two quotations. The first one is for a well-known book by Bermudez on the philosophy of psychology. When we can study a living organism as a collection of particles, a dynamical system, as a structure with complex chemical composition and so on. And in the special case where the living organism has a mind, we might describe it in terms of the cognitive function, of the cognitive mechanism, of the physical structure. This was still David Marr's analysis, classical analysis of the three levels. But something, the interesting aspect of this kind of analysis that is still here. It's not so easy to get rid of these approaches or the understanding that there are this kind of level of explanation. And the second quote is for if there is somebody here who don't like the level idiom. You know, levels are something which, and so we may be more radical. And this is the Nessica tribe. We live in a double world, a world rich in different things, with different nature, behaving in different ways. The laws that describe this world are a patchwork, not a pyramid. They do not take after the simple, elegant, and abstract structure of a system of axioms and theorems. Rather, they look like science as we know it, a partially interdiscipline, apparently arbitrarily grown up, governing different set of properties and different levels of abstraction. I like in this passage the expression science as we know it, because there is something very ideological in certain reductionist reading of science. This was when I asked to Mario, reflect about the expression scientific naturalism, and I think that we agree on that. Because there is the kind of, I make reference to research we were published in good scientific journals, peer-reviewed, and with all the characteristics of scientific enterprise, but they use personal concepts. They make reference to what we may call the personal mind. And in this sense, the personal mind still here. Is not something obsolete or that should be substituted by a better understanding. Of course, we may have better understanding. Let's take the ordinary notion of memory. Of course, now we know that there are many different, the expression memory is ambiguous. We have semantical memory, autobiographical memory, short-term memory, long-term memory, and we know, thank you to Kandel and other people, many analyses of how the fixation of memories works into small animals and human beings, chemical theory of memories, brain localization of memories in the hippocampus. We know a lot of things, but this doesn't mean that in certain aspects we should be content to use the term memory to explain the behavior of people and to predict the behavior of people and so on. And now, the last point, just a few words. There are many agreements between my position and Lynne Baker's position. I don't see that just because Lynne is there, but I appreciate that she knows her work, which is now is very developed in the many books on the subject. And I think that we share the common desire to fulfill one of the reason why people do philosophy. Just to say, people, be aware, don't be so. You should be more careful to drive certain consequences from apparent result from the scientific world or anything. I mean, something important is that we share a critical attitude toward reductive or eliminative account of mental phenomena. I think not because there is something wrong with reduction. When we have reduction, is a good thing. If I can reductive explanation of chemical in terms of physics, why not? But there is something in human beings that should be analyzed at the right level of complexity. So this kind of oversimplification sometimes are a bit dangerous. So I think that philosophy has to defend the complexity of reality. And we share the idea that the personal level is fundamentally cannot be eliminated, or at least for us, for my point of view, is not eliminated, and I cannot see any way in which this can be done in the next future. I don't know. I have no a priori arguments for that. And we share the idea that the explicative supremacy of subpersonal psychology derived from a certain reading of contemporary cognitive scientists is highly controversial, is overstated perhaps. Of course, subpersonal psychology is fundamental, it's quite important, very important. The cognitive unconscious is something very useful, something which may help us to explain a lot of aspects of our behaviors. That is not all. Why then I choose to concentrate myself with scientific research and epistemological issues and not to metaphysical issues. I think there are two reasons. One of them is very idiosyncratic. I'm not a good metaphysician, so I don't dare to discuss about metaphysics with Lynne Baker, who is too good. But there are a few questions that I think I found a few problems. I just would like to mention because I think, sorry, the slide is, I don't know why it is different from constitution theory, of course, is highly controversial. I have nothing to say about that. And the C folks, that is the criticism of Perry and Lewis in her book, criticism of John Perry and David Lewis in the books, Echeitas and the qualitative reading of first-person perspective, empirical data which are not so important according to you. All these aspects are I'm not saying there is something wrong with them, but I would like to suggest this aspect. If we can obtain the same result, that is explain to our eliminativist fellow friends that their conclusions are not justified by the very nature of the scientific enterprise, I think we have an important contribution that maybe may help to accept or to consider in a favorable way, even these metaphysical elements. And in a certain sense, I'm proposing a sort of agreement in difference, which agreement in difference is something we remember to all the Italian present Christian Democrat politicians. You know? But as we learned from the last polls, the last election, we have to die Democrat Christians, so we have to accept it. Thank you very much.
Talk, and now we have 15-20 minutes for discussion. Just a moment, Professor Lynne Baker. Yes, the microphone too.
Thank you very much for a very fine talk, and I just have a question of clarification. Under the epistemological moral, under that heading, you quoted Jose Bermudez. Okay, that I agree. That's an epistemological moral. But you also quoted Nancy Cartwright about the dappled world and different, both of them had to do with levels, but Jose Bermudez has to do with levels of description, levels of explanation, really epistemological stuff. But I wondered if you thought Nancy Cartwright also was concerned with epistemological stuff or ontological stuff. If she means ontological levels, I'm altogether for it. But I don't see why you need to stick to epistemological levels. It seems to me that epistemological levels may be a good reason to think that they're ontological levels.
Here again, I have two answers. One is still another idiosyncratic answer. And when I was, sorry? When I was 30 years old, I went to Geneva and I met Kevin Mulligan. And he washed my brain and he convinced me that we never have to derive ontology. Kevin washed my brain and convinced me that we never have to take ontological conclusion from epistemological premises. And even if I remember, probably the first thing of you that I read was something on mental causation, in which you suggested to invert the explicative. And I don't know. I'm still I'm not sure to be prepared to do this pass. But since I'm probably a few years of philosophy behind me, so maybe I can do that. Anyway, I can understand your point.
Michele, I will stress
the same point that Lynne just raised. I also noticed that if you take Cartwright's quotation, that's essentially ontological. It's about the world. It's not about knowledge. So, and I think you have to go to the same direction. Otherwise, I would think that any reductionist philosopher could agree with you. They could say, look, of course attachment is, we know the physiological basis, but we cannot really reduce the phenomenon. It's too complicated. So there is an upper level that we'll keep for epistemological reasons. Yeah. Also, they can even grant this. In order to identify the relevant brain states, we have to use the upper level phenomena. So when the child shows attachment. But this is just an epistemological question, right? It's about identification. I think instead it may be about individuation. Take Putnam's famous article about the nature of psychology and the nature, the reductionism and the nature of psychology. The one that says that, if you want to go with a stick through a hole that is round, you can go with, just little smaller stick that has a square, round section, but not if it has a square section. Why, he says? Because of geometrical properties that cannot be reduced in principle to physical properties. And the same may be here. And I think we have good reason to think that this is at least possible. And otherwise, what you have said is very good, and I'm entirely convinced that it's right. But even what you don't want, or people you don't want to with you could be happy with what you said. That means the super reductionists.
Yeah, well, I understand your point. I'm not so very self-confident on this, but I may ask this hypothetical reductionist and say, well, what's the matter to say that I'm saying we need a different concept, we need a different level of explanation in order to understand human beings. We have to treat them in a very special way because we need special concept. We have to. So all this is even if I let you to defend your physicalistic ontology, you have to admit that you have to adopt a cognitive.
Of course, but you can say, oh, of course, Michele, this is like chemistry. We need chemistry because we are not smart enough to do only microphysics. So we cannot really talk about H2O. We have to need what you do if you add some other element there, what happens. We have to use the level of chemistry. But of course, the only level is physics here. From an ontological point of view, there is only unless, as some people say, or no, even chemistry cannot be reduced to physics. The same you should do.
Yes, probably is a question of the main interest. I mean, my main interest is something like this. There is people who feel bad, is depressed. Should he go to the psychoanalyst or to take pills? According to my position, that depends. Both strategies are good enough, and the practical solution of his doubts is not affected by the metaphysical question, but is affected by what we know about mental illness. And so in this sense, it doesn't make a lot of difference. Of course, as a philosopher, we want to know how reality is made. So I understand the point, and probably my position is weak. The advantage is that perhaps we may find a much broader sort of yes, we may find. I didn't want to use the word compromise. But I mean, we may share a certain analysis of the situation, our epistemical situation.
Yes, it's less contentious.
Yes.
So that's probably.
But anyway, probably this is because I'm not a good metaphysician. And remember that I was educated into the idea that the basis of metaphysics was language, the philosophy of language. I studied Dartmouth, so for me it's very difficult to, to by the ballet and became a true metaphysician. So, probably you are.
I have a short remark and then a question. The short remark refers to the necessity of different levels of description. So I think, as I got you, and also as I understood your discussion with Mario, you are also, from my point, maybe a bit too liberal. And I think what you really, or what I think we should say is that we need, and there are clear reasons why we need different levels of description. And one of the reasons is, and it's not about reduction. So let's talk about chairs and tables. The chairs and tables in this very room, there's nothing mysterious between the micro level and the macro level. So it's not a question about reduction. You could reduce the properties of this very chair to some kind of micro level, but that's absolutely uninteresting. If we really want to generalize, say, about chairs, yeah, the microphysical properties of this chair, this one there, and this one which is of most likely of steel and of wood, and this one is made out of plastic, they have completely different microphysical structures. So the microphysics doesn't yield the interesting generalizations. The tables, some of the tables may be made of the same microphysical stuff. So the difference is not on the microphysical level, even if the reduction is possible. The difference is on the macrophysical level. And that's one of those strong reasons, as far as I can see, why we need the higher levels of description. So that's only my remark. My question is about the Joycean machine. I couldn't understand why you stick with this with this metaphor. It's a very rhetorical metaphor by Dennett. It's a Joycean machine. It's not a Baudelairean machine or a Zolayan machine. So it's not realistic. Yeah, and that's with rhetoric. So it's what the Joycean machine does. It's completely made up. So if you want to defend some kind of realism of the self, then of course narration is okay, but not the kind of narration or the narrative that Dennett wants to have, where you have some sparse data and then you come up with a story, one of 2,000 possible stories that the multiple drafts model allows for. But you need some realism, and that's why I think you should, some kind of Baudelairean machine or
Tolstoy. Tolstoy.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right.
So, well, as concerns your remark, I agree. It's a good point, and I think that it's a good defense of the idea of the necessity of levels. Right. The reason I wanted to say that in the position that I was presenting was necessary force to be expressed in internal levels, but this is the way in which I do so. And yes, what the Joycean machine, of course, it was a dominant argument. So I took Dennett's metaphor and tried to transform it in a sort of its opposite. I agree with you. We may call it the Dostoevskian machine, which is one of my favorite examples of a kind of investigation at the personal level, which gives a lot of very deep insight of how the mind works. Crime and Punishment is a spectacular analysis of a human mind. Or Tolstoy, I don't know about Jane Austen. What about Jane Austen? Proust. I mean, there are interesting. One thing interesting of that is that there are, for example, David Lodge wrote a paper, Consciousness and Romance, and it was interesting because it described the narrative techniques people use to give the first-person perspective. There are different ways to give them, and of course this is interesting because we find literary instrument to express not the Joycean, Molly Bloom's stream of consciousness. I agree. So, and probably I change my next example, but you know, you probably understand why I started with the Dennett's.
Are there any other questions? If not, maybe it is very late and that we want to. Thank you.